The morning of September 2nd, 1945, broke gray and silent over Tokyo Bay. The water lay flat as hammered pewter beneath a sky that refused to choose between haze and cloud. There was no celebration in the air, no triumphant noise. Hundreds of warships sat at anchor, their guns quiet for the first time in years, and aboard the battleship USS Missouri, the only sound was the shuffle of feet and the occasional snap of a flag in the weak morning breeze. It was a stillness that felt deliberate, almost rehearsed. And in a sense, it was. Nearly every element of what was about to unfold had been arranged by one man. A Japanese delegation of 11 climbed aboard. They came up the gangway slowly, eyes forward, and as they reached the deck, they entered a space that had been composed with the precision of a stage set. The position of the table, the placement of the microphones, the angle of the sunlight, the arrangement of the assembled officers, the flag chosen to fly overhead, none of it was accidental. General Douglas MacArthur had planned each detail personally. He understood something that many soldiers never grasp, that a war does not truly end when the shooting stops. It ends when both sides agree on what the ending means. And the meaning, he had decided, would be written in the language of arrangement and gesture rather than in words alone. The Japanese officers presented an immediate problem. They arrived in formal dress, several of them carrying ceremonial swords, their faces fixed into expressions of perfect stillness. To an outside observer, this might have read as mere composure. But within the code of Bushido that had shaped these men, such stillness was the last available form of dignity in a moment of public humiliation. A face that betrays nothing surrenders nothing of the self. The danger, from MacArthur's point of view, was subtle but real. If the Japanese delegation carried themselves as equals concluding a negotiated arrangement, rather than as a defeated power accepting unconditional terms, then the ceremony would fail at its true purpose, however correctly the papers were signed. MacArthur had studied history closely, and one lesson sat at the front of his mind. After 1918, certain German officers had set about rewriting the story of their defeat almost before the ink had dried. The legend grew that the German army had never truly been beaten on the field, that it had instead been betrayed from within. That myth of the undefeated army festered for 2 decades and helped feed the catastrophe that followed. MacArthur was determined to give the Japanese officer class no such raw material. There would be no room left for a comforting fiction. The defeat had to be total, visible, and impossible to reinterpret later. To understand why gesture mattered so much, one has to understand the psychology of the Japanese officer class. For such a man, the bow was not a courtesy. It was a physical embodiment of an entire worldview, a statement about who stood above whom in the order of things. For 4 years, the bowing had flowed in a single direction across the conquered territories of the Pacific, from the subjugated toward the victorious. The ceremony aboard the Missouri was designed to reverse that current permanently, to make the direction of deference run the other way, and to fix it there. Among the 11 were specific men carrying specific burdens. General Yoshijiro Umezu, chief of the Army General Staff, had opposed surrender to the very end. He had argued for fighting to the last man, and he came aboard that morning carrying out the Emperor's will in form, but not in spirit. Beside him stood Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, who walked with a cane, the legacy of a wound suffered years earlier. Both men bore what one observer described as a kind of controlled contempt, a refusal of the heart that no document could compel them to abandon. They would obey. They would not consent inwardly, and everyone present understood the difference. MacArthur built the architecture of the ceremony as an instrument of meaning. He arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, and he arrived without haste, moving with a deliberate calm that itself communicated mastery of the moment. Behind him stood General Jonathan Wainwright, the officer who had surrendered to Japanese forces in 1942 and endured more than 3 years as a prisoner. Wainwright was gaunt, visibly worn by his captivity. His presence required no explanation and was offered none. It was a message delivered entirely without speech, a closing of a circle that everyone in attendance could read. Then came the signing itself. Shigemitsu approached the table and appeared to study the documents at length, leaning on his cane, taking what felt like far longer than reading required. MacArthur waited in silence, perhaps a full minute, letting the pause stretch. Then, in a quiet voice, he instructed his chief of staff, General Sutherland, to indicate where the signature belonged. The small correction landed without anger and without drama, which made it land all the harder. Umezu signed while standing, refusing to sit, refusing to glance toward the assembled Allied officers, his face an absolute blank. He gave the moment nothing of himself that he could withhold. And yet, the architecture held, because the architecture did not depend on what the Japanese officers felt. They stood on the wrong side of the table. The documents traveled in one direction only, from their hands toward the Allied side. The flag above the deck was American. The ship beneath their feet was American. The bay around them lay under American control. No one announced any of this aloud. Every physical element of the morning announced it instead, and announced the same thing in unison. Umezu did not bow. He kept his rigid bearing to the last. But he signed the surrender of the Japanese Empire on the deck of an American warship, witnessed by a prisoner he had once held beneath a flag that was not his own. The bow, in the end, was the least important part of that morning. MacArthur had built something that did not require it. The ceremony aboard the Missouri lasted only minutes, but its logic governed the years that followed. What MacArthur had arranged on that gray deck was not an ending, but a beginning, and he set about extending the same grammar of meaning into the daily life of a defeated nation. The first decision concerned where he would sit. He placed his headquarters in the Dai-ichi building in central Tokyo, directly across the moat from the imperial palace. Every morning, the people of the city saw the two structures facing one another across the water, the seat of 1,000 years of sacred authority and the office of the foreign general who now held real power over the islands. The choice of location was deliberate, a quiet daily reminder of where decisions were now made. There was no need to announce the new order. The geography announced it, the same way the deck of the Missouri had announced it weeks earlier. The most consequential decision MacArthur made was to leave the emperor alone. He did not arrest Hirohito. Instead, he met him in person on the 27th of September, and from that meeting came a single photograph that would do more work than any proclamation. MacArthur stood in plain khaki, open-necked, hands at his hips, a full head taller than the emperor beside him, who wore formal morning dress. The image ran in every Japanese newspaper. No one had to instruct anyone to bow or to interpret the scene. The photograph said everything on its own, the towering casual figure of the conqueror beside the small formally dressed figure of the sovereign who had once been described as divine. The arrangement of two bodies in a frame carried the message that no speech could have delivered as cleanly. Behind this restraint lay a cold strategic calculation. To arrest Hirohito would have required, by MacArthur's own reasoning, at least 1 million additional soldiers to suppress the unrest that would follow, to garrison a population that revered the man. So instead of destroying the emperor, MacArthur used him. He turned the figure of the sovereign into an instrument of stability. The source of authority had quietly changed hands, flowing now from the occupation headquarters across the moat, but the vessel remained intact and recognizable to the people. Continuity of the symbol bought obedience, while the substance of power moved elsewhere. The men who had signed aboard the Missouri met very different fates, and their fates confirmed the lesson of that morning. Umezu, who had refused to bow and kept his rigid bearing to the end, was arrested in December of 1945. The Tokyo tribunal sentenced him to life imprisonment. He died behind prison walls in January of 1949 of cancer. His perfect composure on the deck had altered nothing in the trajectory that awaited him. Bearing was not the same as power, and his stillness had been, as MacArthur understood, the least important thing about him. Shigemitsu, who had leaned on his cane and studied the documents so slowly, received a sentence of 7 years. He was released early in 1950, and he returned to Japanese political life, serving once again as foreign minister during the 1950s. The contrast between the two men is instructive. The one who had wanted to fight to the last man died in a cell. The diplomat who had walked with a cane returned to shape the nation's foreign relations in the new order MacArthur had built. The defeat had room within it for those willing to live inside the future it created. The documentary record of the ceremony became one of the most reproduced sets of historical images of the 20th century, and the documents themselves carried a final detail of arrangement. On both the American and the Japanese copies, the signatures appear in the same order. First, the Japanese side, then MacArthur. The sequence of the signatures is itself a record of who spoke first and who answered, who presented, and who accepted. Long after the witnesses were gone, the paper would continue to testify to the direction in which authority had flowed that morning. MacArthur's remarks aboard the Missouri had looked forward rather than back. He spoke of peace and expressed his hope for a better world to emerge from the ruin. But this was not sentimentality, and it would be a mistake to read it as softness. It was strategy of the same kind that had shaped everything else. A surrender that leaves the defeated no future creates the conditions for the next war, exactly as the punitive settlement after 1918 had done. MacArthur intended the opposite. He meant to make the defeat total, and at the same time to offer a path forward, so that no faction would have reason to nurse a grievance toward another conflict. The reforms of the occupation were the ceremony continued by other means. A new constitution, written under occupation authority, renounced war as a sovereign right. Land reform broke up concentrated holdings and gave property to those who worked it. The great industrial combines, the zaibatsu, were dissolved. Parliamentary institutions were built and strengthened. Educational curricula were rewritten to remove the militarist ideology that had been taught to a generation. The machinery of the armed forces was dismantled. Each of these measures was an extension of the same calculation that had governed the placement of a table and a flag on a battleship deck. Defeat had to be woven into the institutions of daily life so deeply that it could never be unwoven into a myth. Within a decade of the morning on the Missouri, Japan had become an industrial democracy with a pacifist constitution. The military culture that had driven the empire was systematically pushed out of the institutions that shape a society, and crucially, it was given no space in which to construct a legend of the undefeated army, the legend that had poisoned Germany after 1918. There would be no comforting story of betrayal from within, because the defeat had been made visible, total, and permanent, and then a future had been offered in its place. That is the strategic legacy of Douglas MacArthur. It did not begin with the reforms or the Constitution or the photograph across the moat. It began at 9 o'clock in the morning on the 2nd of September, 1945, on a silent gray deck in Tokyo Bay, where a single man understood that the meaning of an ending must be built, detail by deliberate detail, and made impossible to rewrite.